Welcome to the Mayo Clinic Human Optimization Project, where we're creating the blueprint to help you become the best human you can be so you can give your gifts back to the world. I'm your guide and fellow optimizer, Christopher Camp. Getting high quality sleep is one of the biggest levers we can pull in order to become our best selves. But many of us are self-sabotaging our sleep without even realizing it. There's so many small and little habits and things that we get wrong with our sleep environment that can have a huge detrimental impact on our sleep over time. Accordingly, the title of our session today is How to Fix Your Sleep Environment for Big Gains in Sleep Quality. Our expert guest today is Dr. Timothy Morgenthaler, a professor of medicine in the Division of Pulmonary, Critical Care, and Sleep Medicine at Mayo Clinic. He holds degrees from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Dartmouth College. He previously served in the U.S. Navy as a diving medical officer and as the director for sleep medicine at Mayo Clinic from 2016 to 2024. He's a past president of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and has received numerous awards for contributions to the field of sleep medicine. He's also co-author of the book, Mayo Clinic Guide to Better Sleep, which I would highly recommend to those of you who are looking to improve your general sleep or better understand sleep-specific disorders. So as always, we have three big questions that we're going to tackle with Dr. Morgenthaler today. Those big questions are, number one, what environmental factors have the biggest impact on sleep and why? Number two, what are we getting wrong in the bedroom environment when it comes to sleep? And then number three, what are the most impactful changes we can make to our sleep environment to maximize our sleep quality? Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining us today. Looking forward to diving into this with you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's jump in. So first, we're going to start a little bit about what we mean by these environmental factors and kind of what they are. So can you first define for us what makes up our sleep environment? What is that?
Yeah, so I know a lot of people will jump in when they start talking about sleep environment, and they're thinking mostly of the physical environment. But I really tend to think of it a little bit larger than that. So I think we do need to include the physical environment, which would sort of refer to the things that you would see, hear, smell, feel when you're in the bedroom. So what's the lightness or darkness of the room? A dark room's really important for quality of sleep. Or what's the sound level? Is it quiet? Is it noisy? What's the temperature of the room? Turns out that's a really important factor in the sleep environment. And then there's issues like comfort and clutter, which I would kind of put together for, what's all on your bed. Maybe this is really important for kids. Like, do they have 100 toys in their bed while they're trying to sleep in it, type of thing. And then, sort of the air quality and sense, actually, some people feel are, can be important. So that's the physical part. But I would say the second part of a sleep environment really is the psychological environment. And that may seem a little bit of a stretch, but it turns out, involving your mental and emotional state really affects or impacts your ability to initiate and maintain sleep. So I think they're about stress and worry. Your concerns about your work, your school, your health, money, family. When I talk with patients who have sleep disorders or complaints, very often they'll say, well, I get to bed and then my mind starts getting busy on something. I think we've all experienced that. Mental health conditions would be part of also that sort of psychological environment. And we know that conditions like chronic anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or bipolar disorder, ADHD, all of these are really closely linked to sleep disorders and to sleep disruptions. And actually, they tend to have kind of a bidirectional relationship. So, there are many studies that show that insomnia symptoms predate depression, and depression is worse with insomnia. And if you try to treat just the depression and not the insomnia, more difficult. So they're very closely related. There's the cognitive patterns are still part of this psychological environment. And by that, I mean, what are your positive or negative thoughts about sleep? I often tell my patients, most things in life, the harder you try, the more likely you are to succeed. Sleep is the opposite.
Yes,
you get in bed and say, I will fall asleep. Well, it probably won't under those conditions very well. And so if you have negative thoughts about sleep and kind of maladaptive behaviors, that can actually be an ongoing cause of insomnia. And so those cognitive patterns are important. And then still, I'll put in that psychological environment our sleep habits, because I know you're going to ask me about those, because most people do, but there's a lot of habits that we have that can either help us when we sleep or be harmful for our sleep. So we've talked about physical, we've talked about psychological, and the last one that I would include in the last category I would include in sleep environment, I call temporal environment. So we're talking about time things. And so here we're talking about our circadian rhythm. I know you had a prior podcast about circadian rhythm.
Yes.
So our listeners or viewers could go see that. It was very instructive. But just in short, I mean, every cell in our body has actually genes in it that code for a clock. Most of us will realize that there's times of the day that we get hungry. There's times of the day that our body feels more ready to go run or exercise. There's times of our day when our mind is clear, and there's times of our day when we're going to sleep. That's all gets synchronized by sort of a central timekeeper, and that's really makes up our circadian rhythm, or the rhythm of our body around the day. So paying attention to the temporal environment of our sleep is going to influence how we sleep, and that would include sleep schedule consistency. That would include how much napping did we do earlier in the day, because that's not necessarily the time to sleep, or could it influence our sleep? So again, kind of wrapping those together. The environment, I think, is the physical environment, it's the psychological environment, and it's the temporal environment. It's probably more than you wanted to hear from me.
Yeah, no, that's great too. And I mean, that's an incredible and pretty comprehensive definition, which I think is fantastic. And you're right, we do have some other episodes that cover a lot of these topics. So I'm not going to make you go through all of these in details, but we're going to hit a lot of them.
Okay.
So we got some work ahead of us here. I like how you broke that down to the physical environment, the psychological factors, temporal factors. Yep. And we are going to have, future episodes on some of that. And I think we'll try to focus our discussion here mostly sort of on that physical environment, and then maybe some of the elements that lead up to that. So not just what the bedroom's like while you're sleeping, but maybe kind of the wind down routine leading up to going to sleep if we can. So out of those elements, which ones do you think probably have the biggest impact on our sleep quality? And the reason I ask this is because a lot of what we talk about here on this Human Optimization Project is pulling the big levers, right? And you just gave a long list. And I know there's a temptation for people to say, oh my goodness, I have to fix all of these things.
Yeah.
And in reality, nobody can fix them all at once. And so I think it's probably important for people to recognize a lot of things contribute, some more than others. But in your mind, what are the big things that people need to be focusing on, the biggest ones?
Yeah. So I'm going to stick with my structure a little bit there, but I do understand you want to focus, especially on environment. But I do want to say, of the different things I mentioned, I would say actually the biggest driver are actually the psychological and emotional issues that people bring. And I'm only saying that because, most often when I'm working with patients who are complaining about their sleep, or we're evaluating for sleep disorders, it's actually not very often that they mention, my room is too noisy, or that we'll get into some of those things, because they do mention those, but they almost always will tell you about what's going on with their mind, how it disturbs them, how it affects them, how it, the whole process of not being able to get good quality sleep bothers them. And conversely, when they're not quite sure what's going on, a lot of times if you start digging in, you'll find out that some periods of emotional distress, special stressful things in their life, things like that are going on, really are kind of carrying over into the quality of their sleep. And I think most of our listeners would recognize in their own selves that you can think of a time in your life where hopefully you have times in your life where you're sleeping really, really well, and then something comes along. You have an IRS audit, or you've got some marital distress. Sometimes it doesn't always have to be something bad. I've got a great new job tomorrow. That kind of excitement. So those periods of stress, whether it's eustress or distress, can really affect our quality of sleep. And so I would say, one of the biggest contributors is the emotional or psychological and emotional state. After that, actually, I think it might be more important, the things that are leading up to getting in your bedroom that are more important. So lifestyle and sleep habit choices can really have a big effect on the quality of sleep that you're having. But I don't want to diminish and eliminate the environment. There certainly is some environmental effects. And of the environmental effects, it's all about light, it's about sound, it's about temperature. Those are the so light, noise, and temperature would be the big three in the bedroom that are the most immediately addressable factors.
Okay, perfect. So I think as we go through this, we'll kind of focus on some of those, and then I also like to what you talked about, kind of the hour or two maybe leading up to sleep, some things that we should be doing during that time as a part of a wind down to help us do that. So let's talk a little bit. Why don't we just go through each of those, light, sound, and temperature. So maybe we'll have you start with the light. And I think one of the things that's important, we know that light is critical at night while we're sleeping. But earlier you mentioned sort of the circadian rhythm, and a lot of that is determined by light. So maybe can you give us just your quick take on how light affects sleep, maybe while we're awake and while we're sleeping?
Sure. So, we have to kind of think, first of all, I'll just say there's really no such thing as a night person. I mean, there are people who are kind of night owls and have preferred bedtimes that are later, or morning larks and like to get up early. But in terms of people being, designed to be awake all night and sleep during the day, that isn't how we're designed. And I can say that confidently because if you kind of go look at our neuroanatomy, we are really designed to have daylight in particular reset our clocks. When I was a kid, in elementary school, you'd have the big little dialed clocks up on the wall. And whenever it turned daylight savings time, all of a sudden in the room, you'd see the little hands on the clock dial around at a certain time. And what they're doing is synchronizing the clocks. And that's actually what we have. So in us, light comes in through our iris, hits the back of our eyeball, the retina, and there are some special neurons back there that are called the retinal hypothalamic tracts, so that that light is transferred directly to the part of our brain that contains the master clock. And that master clock then actually decides when to release melatonin. Melatonin then is a hormone that goes to all the rest of our cells in the body to say, hello, when you see this spike in melatonin, if you're a human, that's the time that you should be getting ready to go to sleep. So that really synchronizes us. That serves us very, very well, except when we mess it up. So how can we mess it up? So we can mess it up in a couple different ways. Probably something that most people have experienced is maybe travel. Like let's say, I live in Minnesota. Let's say I fly to Europe for a meeting or something like that. Well, that's going to be 5-6 hours. That is going to definitely put my internal biological clock out of synchronization with the world as I should be experiencing it. And we all call that jet lag, and people have experienced that before. Well, in essence, if you are staying in Minnesota, but now we do things like, okay, I'm going to keep on exposing myself to bright light until 1 o'clock in the morning. Well, our body perceives that just as if we traveled. So we're really kind of throwing our rhythm off. The human body really likes rhythm, especially when it comes to sleep. And so we really want to optimize our sleep to keep a very regular sleep-wake pattern. It turns out, people are sensitive to light. Some are incredibly sensitive to light. My wife, I hope she won't be mad at me for saying this, but it really is kind of true. So if we're in bed and there's a LED 4 rooms over with 5 doors closed between us in there, she knows about it. She's exquisitely sensitive to light. And other people are less sensitive to light. But there have been studies that show actually, kind of in the research setting, that even small amounts of light in the room can influence our sleep. And if you're somebody who's having difficulty sleeping, you really want to work on maximizing the darkness in the room. If you're a shift worker, one of the things we tell people who are shift workers, and we're grateful to have shift workers, is, during the daytime that you're trying to get your sleep, really take efforts to put darkening curtain, light, just put things on your windows that are completely darkening curtains so that you don't have that light coming in. Turn off lights in the room and so forth, because it's going to tend to help you get a better quality of sleep. So that's sort of the light aspect of that. Does that answer that?
It does. So early in the day, important for us to see light, ideally sunlight and natural light if we can, to sort of tell our body, hey, time to wake up, time to start the day, let's get this thing going.
Yes.
Later in the day, important to see that sort of come down to ideally almost, pitch blackness as we are falling asleep and going to sleep.
Yeah, and exactly. And now the kind of the nuance there, I mentioned that I think you and I both live in Minnesota here, which is a northern climate. So, we are now seeing, daylight and sunrise. Daylight is happening sooner and sooner, and sunrise is happening later and later. And so that begins to kind of compress our night day or daytime. Right. And that can lead to, challenges for some people. But, some people will kind of be on the dark side of this and say that, the incandescent light bulb is the enemy of sleep. you could look at it differently and say the incandescent light bulb can be helpful as long as you know how to use it,
Right.
because it does allow us to extend our day, and it actually can be a little bit helpful. As you know, some people suffer from seasonal affective disorder and things, and it's probably mostly light exposure that is the culprit there.
Yeah.
So
And I didn't appreciate that until I moved to Minnesota, and I realized sometimes in the dead of winter the sun's not coming up until 8 o'clock in the morning, and so sometimes you need that to get your day going.
yeah, and many people do benefit from light therapy, applied at the right times.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay. So let's run through. We'll talk in our second section here about some of the other things that we're getting wrong in the bedroom environment when it comes to sleep. So let's talk about. Why don't we break this down into the things maybe leading up into the first couple of hours before we fall asleep, and then while we're asleep.
I'm happy to do that, but you wanted to talk about light, noise, and
sure.
temperature.
Yes.
So, do you want me to talk about those?
Let's do it. So
Okay.
let's do it.
So noise can be very disruptive. We know from a lot of studies that are sort of epidemiological, looking at people who are inner city residents, people who live close to noisy environments and so forth. Certainly your sleep is disrupted. And anybody who's had a noisy neighbor or an obnoxious barking dog next door knows how bothersome that can be. And so, that kind of city traffic noise or indoor noise can be quite a problem. There's actually an interesting research study that was done in Norway where they took residents in a noisy area and they surveyed their sleep quality and what they thought about, how the noise was affecting them. They put in noise insulation into their homes, some special insulation layers, and then they surveyed, how did that noise-reducing panel affect your sleep? There was a very appreciable improvement in sleep, and it lasted for quite some time, as I recall, 1 or 2 years. So we know that can be a way to help people. Not all of us can go install noise dampening, insulation in our homes, but I think if we just most of us have traveled maybe a little bit. You kind of remember arriving at a hotel room. When you first get there, you can hear the guy's television on from next door. You're thinking to yourself, oh no, what kind of a night is this going to be? And then you go over and you turn on your air conditioning unit. And the air conditioning unit kind of comes on, makes a little bit of what we call white noise or gray noise, and all of a sudden you don't hear the television. Now, we know the television didn't go off just because you turned that on. So use of a noise machine, a white noise machine or a gray or pink noise machine, I'm not quite sure how people want to term it, can be helpful to sort of dampen or reduce the influence of noise, of that disruptive noise for many people. Other people, maybe like my wife, would be very sensitive to even the gray noise. They just need quiet. So that's a challenge. And then the temperature thing.
Hang on, let me ask you real quick about the
Yeah.
noise piece. So is it okay to still have some noise, but we tend to do better if it's sort of a constant, consistent background noise as opposed to the random television, dog barking, neighbors making a party next door? So there's a difference between those two.
Definitely a difference. So one of them sort of tends to grab our attention. There's something different. And it's probably we are programmed a little bit that way. I don't know that let's just think of ourselves as, hunter-gatherers or survivors. We're out on the forest floor trying to grab a nap. You kind of want to know if there's some new noise. And so our brain is programmed to say, hey, there's a new noise. Or mothers, oh, there's babies crying. We sort of are programmed to pick up those different features. When you have more of kind of a gray noise, it tends to suppress the importance of those distracting noises. And in fact, just kind of an engineering nerdy thing, most people know noise is measured as a decibel. Well, a decibel is actually measured in sound pressure as a ratio of the signal, what's the obnoxious thing, to the background signal.
Oh.
So it's actually measured in kilopascals of pressure. So it's a ratio of the noise to the background noise. So if you raise the background noise, you're actually the intent of this goes away.
Didn't know it.
Yeah.
Love it. Okay, good. All right, so now talk to us about temperature.
Temperature, yeah. This is really kind of recently my wife and I went to go buy a mattress, and temperature is all the rage right now in mattresses. But so I'll tell you what I know about
You're hopefully going to solve some problems for me in my marriage too with this statement too. So I'm listening intently.
I'm going to get in a lot of trouble from my wife for this. But so there is a really pretty well founded collection of data about temperature. The room temperature that really works best for people to get good sleep is between about 60 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit. If it gets too much colder than that in the room, that tends to decrease the depth and quality of the sleep. If it gets hotter than that, also the same. And I draw on our listeners' experience. Have you ever spent the night in a hot, sweaty, humid room that you can't get circulation in? You can remember that your sleep was difficult,
Right.
and lots of interruptions, and just not very pleasant. So, you really, if you stay within that range of 60 to 72, people tend to fall asleep faster. They sleep more deeply. They spend more time in sort of the restorative stages of sleep. But of course, it's also the microclimate under the covers, because when it goes down to 60, we don't just like lay out on the bed and say, I'm going to freeze and that's going to be good for me. We do change our bed covers. So the microclimate, when they've looked at, putting little temperature probes on the skin and so forth, the average temperature that's kind of helpful is between 86 and 91 degrees. Now, I haven't ever seen a blanket that measures the temperature. Maybe somebody will come up with that, but that's just what the research shows. So what does that really mean for us? Well, it means that, whether it's winter or summer, it might be helpful for us to try to program our room temperature so it stays between 60 and 72. But then, clearly we tend to use not a feather duvet in the middle of the summer, and in the winter we, probably are not going to just be sleeping with sheets. So you'll change your bed covers. And, there's reason to believe that there's some, not high quality research, but there is some research that kind of shows that the breathability of whatever the bed coverings and your pajamas or whatever, it may be important. So you want something that can kind of breathe, that doesn't cling and hold a lot of moisture, and that just helps you regulate your temperature better. But the interesting thing there's two other interesting things about temperature, and it turns out so I've told you the average. I tried to be careful with that average.
Right.
It turns out it matters where the heat is applied, because it can be good or bad for you. So, for example, if it's cooler weather and you heat your feet, like let's say with one of those, there's like these little bean things that you can heat up in the microwave or things like that, that actually does on average help people fall asleep a little bit more quickly. And you can also use temperature in a slightly different way. Like let's say it's winter, if you get in a warm shower, maybe 30 to 60 minutes before bed, that actually may help you fall asleep more quickly. That's not just a wives' tale. And the way that they think that works is when you get in and you take a warm shower, the skin vasodilates, it brings more of the blood to the surface. And then when you get out of the shower, you actually will tend to cool more rapidly. And our body, that part of that circadian rhythm is our temperature starts falling at the time that we're supposed to be getting sleepy. So it may actually help you get to sleep more quickly. So there's been kind of interesting studies of, differentially exposing the body to different, temperatures, like warming the feet seems to help, warming the hands may help a little bit. The converse of the shower thing is in the summer, where maybe it's been very cold or very hot outside, you may be better off to take, just a kind of a tepid shower just to help cool your body before you go to bed, if you're having troubles going to sleep.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So one of the questions I have about this is oftentimes we think about sleep quality as my ability to fall asleep or stay asleep. And I'm wondering, is it possible that some of these things are affecting my sleep and I'm not even aware of it? So for instance, I can fall asleep, no problem. I stay asleep through most of the night. But is it that there may be background sounds or background light that's actually reducing the quality of my sleep, but is not bad enough to wake me up?
Yes is the answer. So, when we do sleep studies in people in the laboratory, where we study their brain waves, muscle tone, eye movements, breathing, oxygenation, all those sort of things, we, in that kind of a study, we have probably the most robust information that we're going to get about their people's sleep. And when we see that, we're noticing a few things. First of all, sleep, it's not like sleep and wake. It's wake and then different stages of sleep.
Right.
So stage 1 sleep is a kind of an artificial category. It really means you're half awake and half asleep. And it's just the very beginnings of sleep. You'll see some signs of drowsiness. You'll see some slowing of the brain waves, but they're not as slow as they are when you get to stage 2. Stage 2, things are very stable. You're in sleep. There's certain kinds of EKG or EEG patterns that the brain produces to kind of let you know that certain activities are going on. And then when you get into stage N3 or stage 3 sleep, that's what we would call in sleep medicine, we call that deep sleep. Now, why do we call it deep
That's the
sleep?
good stuff.
Well, it's all good.
Yeah.
I'd say stage 2, 3, and rapid eye movement, which we'll handle in a moment, are all good. Stage 1, if all we got was stage 1, we'd probably not be happy because it's just, again, it's sort of half awake, half asleep. But N3, the reason we call it deep sleep is because have you ever gotten a call in the middle of the night and it takes you a little minute to kind of really wake up and know where you are? And
Absolutely.
Most doctors have had that experience.
Mm-hmm.
That's N3 sleep, probably.
Okay.
It's very difficult to wake up from N3 sleep. We tend to have a little bit of what we call sleep inertia. It's just kind of like
Right.
my body's moving, but I'm not quite sure I'm all the way there. So we see these different stages of sleep. We see rapid eye movement sleep, which is when people often, that's when we're doing a lot of our active dreaming process and certain physiology takes place. But in addition to that, we'll see little what we call arousal. So an arousal is a transition from one of those sleep stages to awake brain EEG pattern for at least 3 seconds, but not as long as 15 seconds, because then we would say you woke up.
Yeah, and the body doesn't think it's waking up or doesn't know it's waking up.
Take a guess how many of those. I'm going to assume for a moment you're a normal sleeper. How many of those do you think you have per hour?
Per hour?
Yeah.
Oh, I would say 10 to 15.
Yeah, 15.
15, okay.
Yeah, 10 to 15 is exactly right. And, people, when I tell them, well, you had 15 arousals per hour, and you're like,
Yeah.
But again, if we think about this just from, sort of like, what does it take for us to survive? Again, I'm laying out there on the forest floor surrounded by hostile things.
Mm-hmm.
Something has to let me know that the forest is on fire. Something. So a lot of times I kind of envision it, like you're a submarine. And these old World War II movies, how do they know what's going on? They put the periscope up,
Right.
they kind of look around a little
Check
bit,
it out,
goes
yep.
back down, and hopefully nobody knew that it happened, right?
Right.
That's kind of what our arousals can be like.
Interesting.
Now, if we have a lot of those arousals and we have some pain, discomfort, noise, something irritating in the room, then it translates into kind of an awakening, and now I'm more aware of it. But getting to your precise question, which is, well, could I have a bad quality sleep and not know it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the answer is yes. And we don't have really perfect correlates. So like if I, let's say I looked at a bunch of people, they don't have a sleep disorder, they all slept about 7 hours, I have their polysomnogram in front of me. One has 10 arousals per hour, one has 15 arousals per hour, the other has 20 arousals per hour. Wouldn't you think that last one would say, oh, my sleep quality wasn't as good as the first one? Mm-hmm. It doesn't. It's not as clean as that. So there are other aspects of the neurologic function, and probably if we want to really, I don't know if this is going deeper or shallower, the emotional aspects of their sleep.
Sure.
That really may have that have more explanatory power than those brain waves.
Yeah.
So it's an inexact answer that I can give you, but for sure. What we can manipulate is sleep time, timing, and duration. That is a very important lever in all of this.
Okay. So speaking of timing and duration, I'd like to hear a little bit more about those 2 to 3 hours leading up to sleep. So what are some of the most common mistakes people make in those couple hours preceding going to bed at night?
So I would say I'm going to give you 5 S's.
Okay.
So shade, silence, surface, safety, and we'll say seasonal coolness. That's because I had to get a 5th S, and it would have been a T. But by shade, again, I'm going to think about how we're managing our light exposure. So we talked already about what's happening from a physiological basis with the light dimming, and then that's when the melatonin rises, and it kind of signals us that, it's time to go to sleep. If we do things like expose our eyes to bright light, particularly like while we're in bed, we'll say. Mm-hmm. It's only when you first turn that off that now your body starts thinking, maybe it's time to think about getting to bed. But there might be quite a delay, and particularly if you continually expose yourself to light later and later and later, you're going to have a problem with this.
And do you mean particularly if that light is a blue light that's right in front of your face
Yes,
as
sir.
you're scrolling infinitely?
And I'll just say bright, because I know much has been made about blue versus other wavelengths of light, and it does seem that blue is bad, but it's not clear that, I know many, like my iPhone, maybe your, whatever, they have blue light filters that you can turn on, and at least clinically, we're not seeing a huge difference in those. So I generally have to just say light exposure.
Any light. Okay.
Yeah, light exposure.
Helpful.
And the brighter and closer to your eyes, probably the worst. Mm-hmm. One other thing just to talk about with that light exposure, because you kind of brought up the screen devices. I'm not a cell phone Nazi that says, they all have to be locked at the front door 2 hours before bedtime. But, if you are somebody who's having a difficult time falling asleep, and really probably for anybody, the light exposure is not helpful and can be very counter-helpful, but even more so, most of us, if we're looking at a screen in bed, we're engaging with that.
Yes.
And so that kind of death scrolling or doom scrolling or engaging in games or watching Netflix or whatever is actually quite activating. And we really do kind of need a little bit of a runway time to get into the state for sleep. So that's the shade thing. Again, I think you want to kind of make your bedroom dark and avoid unnecessary exposure, close exposure to light. Silence, you certainly want to try to get things quiet in your home. That can be very challenging if you have young children and things like that. But, there does have to be sort of a wind down for most people. The surface I mentioned, I'm not a person who thinks we all have to go out and buy, multi-$1,000 beds. But, if you have a mattress that's 10 years older, you'd really need to examine it and see if it's really comfortable. People do better with a more comfortable mattress. Safety I mentioned.
Yeah. What does that mean?
Yeah. So safety, there have been studies where they ask people about how safe they feel in their homes. And you might imagine people who are in, maybe bad neighborhoods, or I'm just thinking more globally here, people who are in dangerous parts of the world, they don't sleep as well. They don't sleep as well. And it's not always the enemy outside too. We know that people who are fearful inside their homes, either from domestic violence or they're having just fear in general, they're not going to sleep as well. And so, hopefully people aren't struggling with that. But if so, that would be something to address. And then
that certainly gets to a lot of the psychological factors that you mentioned earlier as well. Yeah. Okay.
And then we already talked about temperature. So I think those are some big mistakes that people make in their environment. Now, I guess you asked me actually about wind down. I was talking about problems in the environment. So I don't know if maybe you could give me on that.
No, you absolutely did. That's incredibly helpful. So if those are environmental factors to be thinking about as you approach bed, are there other things that we should be doing or thinking about as we start to wind down in those couple of hours? So I do think it makes sense to start dimming lights, turning off noises, try to disengage cognitively if we can. Or are there other things we need to be thinking about in those couple of hours leading up to bed?
Caffeine, alcohol, and heavy meals. So caffeine, let's take that
we're saying
first.
These things are not good or they're good?
Well, it depends. It depends.
All right.
So caffeine, many people don't realize caffeine has what we call a half-life of 5 to 7 hours. So what that means is after you've had a dose of caffeine, 5 to 7 hours later, the amount of caffeine in your bloodstream will be half what it was when you finished your cup of whatever it was that had caffeine in it. But what that really means is it takes we often in medicine will think about like 5 half-lives before it's actually gone.
Right.
Okay. So in the research setting, when I have my cup of Starbucks in the morning, they could actually measure the difference that makes in my sleep at night.
Wow.
With very tuned spectral analyses. From a practical clinical point of view, I think most people are better off to cut off caffeine at least 5 to 6 hours prior to bedtime.
Okay.
And if you're somebody who's struggling with sleep or trying to improve your quality of sleep, confine it to the morning and not that much.
Yeah.
That's really going to be helpful. Alcohol, funny substance. Again, alcohol is not for everybody, and this, especially these last 2 years, all the news is that maybe there's no safe dose of alcohol for us, but some people would enjoy an alcoholic beverage, and it won't cause problems for them in general. But with sleep, alcohol is a funny thing. It does make one drowsy initially. People are familiar with the terms of nightcap and things like that, but it's actually bad for sleep. And the alcohol itself makes you drowsy, but then it's metabolized. And 2 important metabolites of alcohol are acetaldehyde and acetone. And actually both of those tend to fragment sleep and kind of interfere with getting to a deeper and more continuous sleep. So many of my patients will tell me that if they have alcohol close to bedtime, they'll notice that their sleep is not as good. If you have a tendency towards obstructive sleep apnea or upper airway closing with the relaxation that happens at night, alcohol actually completely destroys the reflex that helps us keep our airway open. So most bed partners will tell their bed partner that they snore much worse with
Interesting.
alcohol.
Yeah.
So I think the key thing with alcohol is if you're going to have an alcohol, you should really have it 3 to 4 hours at least prior
Before
to
you go to
bedtime
bed.
if you can.
Okay.
And then heavy meals. If you have a heavy meal within 3 hours prior to bedtime, you're at danger of having some reflux. There's actually some work involved in digesting. Many people will be aware that their intestines are active, and it can really interfere with sleep.
And I imagine it's so many factors that it's pretty easy for these things to become additive, right, and work against you.
Very definitely. Let's go out to a late party,
right.
expose ourselves to bright light, have some alcohol and a heavy meal. What do you say?
Yeah, a lot of noise,
Yeah.
and yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. Okay, well, incredibly helpful. So long list of items here, which I think is good. Now, I think we're going to talk a little bit about targets and some impactful changes that we can make. And I think, obviously, you've listed a lot of great things, and a lot of people can look at this and say, okay, I'm doing well in these things, I'm doing poor in certain things, and they can pretty intuitively think about what they need to work on. But I think it may be helpful to give people sort of a framework or a structure in which to approach this, because it'd be very easy to say, ooh, that's a lot of
Too
stuff.
much.
It's too
Yeah.
much, forget it.
Sure.
I'll just be tired the next day.
Sure.
So how can we kind of organize this for people and give them a practical approach in our third section here, where we like to start giving them some answers?
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to the original organization that I mentioned of sort of physical, emotional, psychological, and temporal, because I think some of these are kind of quick wins, and then some of them take a little longer.
Mm-hmm.
So the quick wins, if you think about, let's just go to that physical. It won't take a person long to go into their sleep environment and say, okay, what can I do about the temperature? You can figure that out. It might be a temperature setting. It might be some things you have to do in your room, things like that. You can say, okay, what about noise? Reflect on your recent experience. What can I do about noise? If I can't reduce noise, eliminate noise, how about a noise perfume or a white noise generator? They're available, at Walmarts and all kinds of other places, or your cell phone can probably do it just fine. And then the temperature, the noise, and light. Just do a light inventory. Go in your room at night and say, okay, what's on, and what can I turn off? And if you're having problems with that, my wife's happy to do a consult for you, because she will tell you everything that's on in your entire house.
Yes.
But you can amend those things very quickly. It might take a little bit of an investment or something, but those are usually very quickly, and those will improve people's sleep quality right off the bat.
One of the things I'd like to point out for people too is that most of these things you can automate. Like, one of the things that's hard about life is that so much of the things we try to improve, you have to keep doing every day. You got to keep showing up. Well, a lot of these problems, if you figure them out, you solve them. The problem is solved.
Oh, exactly. I mean, like temperature.
Right.
I think many of us now have smart. Thermostats and so forth, and you can program it. I
Set a
program
timer.
it goes down to 68 degrees by the time I usually go to bed. So it's probably going to be there by the time I usually go to bed. So you're exactly right. Light, you can, depends on how fancy you want to get with smart bulbs and things like that. But
Right.
Mostly in the bedroom, it's about just kind of going on the rampage and eliminating things.
Getting rid of stuff.
Yeah, getting rid of stuff, getting darkening curtains up if you're living near street lamps and things like that.
Right.
So yeah,
Right.
absolutely true.
Okay, good. All right, so those are some of the quick wins. Any other quick wins before we go to the harder ones?
I think those are probably the quickest wins right there.
Okay.
I would say the next quick wins. So I'm going to go kind of, quick, medium, and long.
All right, let's
okay?
go medium
The
now.
medium
Yeah.
ones, I would say, and I think these can be huge impact, is sleep timing.
Okay.
Sleep timing. This is one of the most impactful things to do in people who have insomnia, believe it or not. You can tell them really about 3 simple things to do. And if they implement this and are consistent about it, their sleep often will improve. Number 1, pick a wake-up time.
Okay.
Pick a wake-up time. And a lot of times people say, well, work day or weekend. And I would say, pick a wake-up time. And then I will say, okay, give yourself 30-minute leeway. But seriously, pick a wake-up time. Pick the wake-up time and plan on, you're going to set an alarm for that wake-up time. Even if you think you're going to wake up before that alarm, set the alarm so that if you wake up in the middle of the night, you don't have to look at a clock, because you'll know, do I hear an alarm? It's not time to get up yet. And so when you hear the alarm, or when you really get up and it's light already, okay, now it's time to get up and go expose yourself to some light. Sunlight would be best. Eat breakfast in front of a window. Do something like that. Go for a walk. Get sunlight. If you can't get sunlight, get artificial light, but set a wake-up time. Number 2 is count backwards from the wake-up time and don't go to bed any sooner than 8 hours prior to that. And think about going to bed 7 hours prior to that.
Okay.
even if that's later than you usually think of yourself going to bed. But I'm using the words go to bed, not go to sleep, because what we really want to strive for is you sleeping most of the time that you're in bed.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to watch TV before bed, okay, I would say fine, not too close to bed, but do it in another room. Don't do it in your bed.
Mm-hmm.
Because the light in your bed, again, the content is engaging, the light is in your eyes, it's going to delay your sleep time. And we know from research it's absolutely true. I mean, engagement like with a cell phone in bed delays sleep time on average by 45 minutes to an hour from what people who don't use them in bed are.
Got it.
So that's number two is schedule your bedtime and your go to bed time and your wake up time. And then the modification of that is do not modify your wake up time. You've committed to that. But if you're not sleepy at your planned bedtime, don't go to bed. Wait until you're sleepy. Go to bed when you're sleepy.
Okay.
So those, working on the schedule. Now, I say that might sound like you could do it overnight. You can't. You really need, especially if you're married or you have a partner or other people you're living with. It usually takes some scheduling and some collaboration to kind of work that all out.
Right.
You may have childcare duties, you may have work duties, and so forth. But work on getting that done. That's why that's kind of an intermediate step. But it's a very powerful step. If you do that and the sleep environment, I'll bet you'll have a lot of gains already.
Okay, fantastic. So you set this up, some quick wins, some medium wins.
Yep.
I'm imagining there's going to be some more difficult
Behavior
wins.
mods.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Got
now we're getting into the nuances. So, for example, we know that people who exercise regularly will get deeper and better quality sleep. Not necessarily if you exercise right close to bedtime, but so how are you going to get that into your daily structure? We know people who eat healthier and who eat smaller meals in the evening are going to sleep a little better at night. So that may be something that you have to work on. We mentioned the importance of stress, anxiety. How does one manage that? You may need to find ways to deal with that. That could be either with the aid of a healthcare provider or actually things like yoga, meditation, progressive relaxation, breathing. These sorts of things can be very helpful. But you really have to decide that you're going to do those. You can't just tip your toe in the water and try it. You have to do those consistently over a period of time. But they can be very, very helpful. I guess some of the other things we talked about that would be more in the difficult realm would also be, if you have mental health problems, are you being managed to the best effect and so forth. So you may really have to engage in that over a longer investment of time and effort.
Speaking of things that may be more difficult to control, what about other people in the bedroom?
It's very important to think about that because that comes into play in almost everything we talked about. Let's, for example, let's talk about temperature. One person likes it hot, the other person likes it cold. In Europe, it's very common actually for the two partners in bed to have different bed covers to account for that. We don't tend to do that as much in the United States. Maybe we should learn something from that.
Right.
Some of our beds now are being designed so that you can regulate the temperature a little bit differently on one than the other. So there's some things that you may have to invest in equipment costs, shall we say, to negotiate the differences that can make a difference in your things. But then there's just is it better to co-sleep or not co-sleep?
Right.
And it's very interesting. There's a historical perspective on this. If we were to transport ourselves back to late 1800s, most wealthy and well-to-do people slept in separate beds. In most of those Victorian bedrooms, we would have seen two beds in the bedroom. And the reason is because probably we do sleep better if we are in our own bed. But on the other hand, most people, if they're in a good relationship, enjoy that togetherness.
There's a trade-off.
And so there's a trade-off that's made. People also ask me, what about pets? And there's good research done on pets. In fact, Lois Cron and her colleagues down in Mayo Clinic, Arizona, published a nice study on this recently where they looked at this. And, I think their net answer is if the pet is comforting to you and you love the pet and you aren't disrupted by pet behaviors, keep the pet. But if the pet is one that has to be walked 3 times per night and is, chewing up the bedroom and walking all over the place and disrupting your sleep, then you need to have a conversation with yourself about what's more important, the pet or your health.
I love it. So, and honestly, the The partner piece is one that we saw. Actually, we struggled with for a little while. My wife, she's always cold and needs more blankets than I do. So she tends to steal the covers from me. And we actually we sleep under the same cover, but then she has an extra weighted blanket
add-on
she puts on top. Yeah. Which is then nice because I think it keeps her warm and holds her down so she's not stealing the covers. So it was a win-win for us.
One other thing in those lines, that since we're talking about sleep, we'd be remiss to talk about disruptions of sleep by the bed partner that are more than just the rolling over, stealing the covers, but snoring can be a big issue.
Yes.
And there is help for snoring, and oftentimes snoring can be a early warning system of sleep apnea. And if people have snoring and sleep disruption, really you should get treated, because we actually talk about something that's called the spousal arousal syndrome, and there is measurable impact on poor quality of the bed partner if you're sharing the bed with somebody who snores quite loudly. And the other thing is there are also some sleep disorders where people do move around a great deal in the bed and can even get violent without knowing it in their sleep. And that really needs to be attended to with probably some help from a healthcare provider.
That describes every one of my children when they climb into the bed with us when they were really young. All right. Well, this is great. And I think you highlight, too, this is one of those things. Number one, it's critically important. It affects sort of every aspect of our life, so it's important. Second, it is individualized. We're all a little bit different. And third, we don't live in a vacuum. We have these different competing factors and interests. There's trade-offs for every decision, so we got to figure out what works best for us. This was incredibly enlightening for me. I took a lot of notes here, and I'd like to summarize those, but I like how you structured and you organized everything, which I think will give people a good way to approach this. So in my summary, when we think about the sleep environment, there's really three things to think about. There's the physical environment, the psychological component, and then also the temporal component, meaning our circadian rhythm, sleep schedule, napping, and those types of things. So you can look at those three different categories. In the physical environment, there's a lot of different things, but the biggest things being light, sound, and temperature. So for light, you want to see bright light early upon waking, get it dark before you go to bed. For sound, quiet is good, but actually having a more consistent sound without these sharp amplitudes is probably the most important. And then for temperature, we talked about in the room, 60 to 72 degrees for most people. You gave us some great strategies for, hot showers, heating your feet, et cetera. You also gave us thinking about the shade, silence, surface, safety, and then seasonal coolness or different changes in temperatures. We also talked about some substances and things to avoid: caffeine, alcohol, and heavy meals. And then when it comes to actually developing a strategy for improvement, I like how you gave us sort of the quick wins, the medium wins, and the hard wins. And I'm going to recap those really quickly if you don't mind. So some of the quick wins: set the right temperature. Second, optimize the noise situation as you discussed. And then third, take a light inventory and reduce it as much as possible. And then also the other tips you gave us too: avoid caffeine, probably 6 to 8 hours before bedtime, no alcohol 3 to 4 hours before bedtime, and no heavy meals 3 to 4 hours leading up to bedtime. The medium wins: sleep timing being the big one. So pick your wake up time, work backwards from there to set your going to bed time, but then don't go to bed until you're sleepy. So really use the bed just for sleep. And
sleep and sex.
Sleep and sex. And then for some of the more challenging or hard wins, those are often behavioral modifications, but it comes back to a lot of the things that we talk about on this podcast every day. So exercising regularly will help. Eating healthy will help. Regulating your stress and anxiety will also help. So those are some things that will have big wins, not only for your sleep, but in every other area of life. So now I'll give you the chance to summarize by asking the three big questions here, and we'll get some rapid fire answers. So what environmental factors have the biggest impact on sleep?
Yeah, I'd go back to the physical ones of light, sound, and temperature. But I wouldn't want to neglect, though, the other issues that we talked about.
Okay, great. And then our second big question: what are we getting wrong in the bedroom environment when it comes to sleep? So those three, I would imagine. Then what are some of the other ones?
Well, I think if we concentrate on those three, since it's a little bit repetitive, I'd say, what are we bringing to bed with us? Mm-hmm. And that would have to do with the timing and the emotional and psychological content and the unhealthy habits, perhaps, that influence how well we're going to sleep.
Excellent. And then would you agree, so the most impactful changes that we can make to our sleep environment, you sort of laid out that structure for us: quick wins, medium wins, hard wins. I would imagine you would suggest to the audience start with the quick wins.
I would. I think, it's first of all, it's always nice to win. Everybody likes winning.
Right.
So if you can do those, put your list together. I would just kind of say it's a to-do list. Let me do it this weekend.
Mm-hmm.
So you can get those things from the to-do list to the to-done list very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think if those have been problems in your bedroom, you're going to see some improvements right away. Isn't that nice? Yeah. Now let's attack the intermediate. I love it. So because those ones, also that might take a little bit of work, but you'll see a lot of fruit from those. The other ones, also important, but they do take longer.
Take time. Okay. So I always like to end this with a challenge, and you've made it very easy for us today. You've teed this up nicely. So our challenge or our action item for people is to pick one of those things: light, sound, or temperature. Just pick one off the quick wins list, and then actually you could add avoid caffeine, avoiding alcohol, and heavy meals. So there you go. So 6 options to choose from. Pick one of those, fix it, and then pick the next one, fix it. Once you have those 6 items taken care of, then move over into the medium wins category and then the hard wins. So you've outlined that very nicely. Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining us for this. I think it's been incredibly informative to our audience. Our title today was How to Fix Your Sleep Environment for Big Gains in Sleep Quality. Dr. Tim Morgenthau is our guest. Really appreciate everything you had to say and everything you taught us.
My pleasure. It was a joy. Thank you.
And remember to our audience to live intentionally, consistently better. Keep striving to be the best human you can be so you can give your gifts back to the world and never stop optimizing. Thanks for listening to the Mayo Clinic Human Optimization Project. If you like this episode, hit subscribe and leave a review. It helps others find us. Know someone who might benefit? Share the episode with them to join us in our mission to help as many people as possible become the best humans they can be. Have feedback or a topic idea? Email us at optimize@mayo.edu. And be sure to look for us on Instagram, X, and YouTube.
This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be relied upon for medical, professional, or legal advice. Always consult with a qualified professional for any questions. The appearance of any guest does not imply an endorsement of them, their employer, or any entity they represent. The views and opinions expressed by the guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Mayo Clinic. Reference to any product, service, or entity is for informational purposes only and does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by Mayo Clinic.